Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States where every state has a story, and today we're covering some of those stories in Maryland. Now, frankly, I wasn't sure what to expect, but when I found out your official state drink was milk, I knew we were going to have a good time. Regardless, your state has some downright chilling stuff going on, from strange science experiments that observe the effects of strange substances on people's minds, to experiments investigating social breakdown in rat populations, to less scary stuff like monuments to former presidents that are totally undervalued. Your lore was a blast to cover Maryland. Now, before we jump into these stories, a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy these deep dives into America's strangest tales, dropping a comment and a like, and hitting that subscribe button like it just called Old Bay seasoning mid would help me out more than anything as I struggle my way up this hill towards 100,000 subscribers in 2025. Anyways, with that, let's get into the video. Okay, so I assume you've seen the movie The Exorcist, right? Or at least you've likely heard of it. If not, it's essentially a story about a little girl who starts acting super weird, like head spinning, pea soup spewing weird. So her mom calls in some priests for the ultimate spiritual house cleansing. Turns out she's possessed by a demon who's got a serious attitude problem and a flair for the dramatic. A veteran priest and a younger crisis of faith priest team up to evict the unwelcome guest, but not without some major supernatural chaos. In the end, the demon gets the boot, but not before reminding everyone why you should never skip church. Everyone learns that demons are jerks, priests are no nonsense, and if you're going to live in an old house, maybe invest in some exorcism insurance if State Farm offers that in your region. Anyways, that story, the one you likely thought was fueled by purely Hollywood sensationalism, as crazy as it is based on a true story that starts right here in Maryland. In the late 1940s, in Cottage City, Maryland, a 14-year-old boy known by the pseudonym Roland Doe, or Robbie Mannheim, found himself at the center of one of the most famous exorcism cases in history. Roland, an only child from a German Lutheran family, was particularly close to his Aunt Harriet, who introduced him to the infamous Ouija board, because what could possibly go wrong with that? Well, after Aunt Harriet passed away, things started getting weird. Strange noises echoed through the house. Furniture moved on its own, and household objects suddenly took flight, apparently developing a personal vendetta against gravity. The family, rightfully disturbed by their suddenly haunted living room, sought help from their Lutheran pastor, Luther Miles Schultz, in early 1949. Schultz, eager to investigate, had Roland spend the night at his home, where he witnessed bizarre activity firsthand. His professional diagnosis? Yeah, you should probably call in a Catholic priest. Taking Schultz's advice, the family turned to Father Edward Hughes, a Catholic priest in Washington, D.C., who agreed to perform an exorcism at Georgetown University Hospital, a Jesuit-run institution. But Roland wasn't exactly a cooperative patient. During the ritual, he allegedly broke free of his restraints, yanked out a bed spring, and used it to slash Hughes's arm. That was enough to send Hughes out of the game, and the exorcism was abruptly called off. I should note here, some sources, most actually, say that under the guidance of Hughes, Roland underwent multiple exorcisms, so the incident with the bed spring may have occurred during their final exorcism. Meanwhile, Roland's condition continued to worsen, with scratches mysteriously appearing on his body. At one point, the word Lewis reportedly emerged on his ribcage, which the family took as a sign to pack their bags and head to St. Louis, Missouri, where they had relatives. Either it was a divine message or the demon was just really into travel suggestions, I guess. Once in St. Louis, the family reached out to priests at St. Louis University, SLU, leading to the involvement of Father William S. Bowdern and Raymond J. Bishop. When the priests visited Roland at his relative's home in the suburb of Belnor, they reportedly witnessed classic horror movie symptoms: a shaking bed, objects flying across the room, and Roland suddenly speaking in a deep guttural voice, an impressive trick for a teenager. After obtaining permission from the local archbishop, the priests decided it was time for a full-scale exorcism, which took place at the Alexian Brothers Hospital in South St. Louis. Nothing says healing environment like a battle with the forces of hell in a hospital's psychiatric wing. The exorcism itself was no easy feat. The rituals, which began in March of 1949, stretched over several weeks, during which Roland continued to display alarming symptoms. He allegedly became violent, spoke in languages that he'd supposedly never learned, and showed an extreme aversion to sacred objects. Father Walter Halloran, who was brought in to assist, later recalled seeing words like evil and hell appear on Roland's skin. He also recalled that Roland, in what must have been one of the most physically aggressive possession episodes in history, managed to break his nose during the process. Despite all this, the priests pressed on, and finally, on April 18th of 1949, after one last intense session, Roland suddenly snapped out of his possessed state, looked up, and announced, "It's over." Just like that, the demonic entity was gone, and Roland went on to live what Halloran described as a rather ordinary life, hopefully one that involved zero Ouija boards. Of course, not everyone was convinced that this was a genuine case of demonic possession. In the following decades, skeptics like author Thomas B. Allen, who actually wrote a book regarding the true details of this event, and Joe Nichols suggested that Roland was simply a troubled teen with a flair for the dramatic. Some researchers argued that his symptoms could be explained by psychological disorders, attention-seeking behavior, or even elaborate pranks. Others pointed out that many of the most shocking details of the case came from second-hand accounts, exaggerations, or just plain hearsay. Also, while some claimed that Roland miraculously spoke Latin, one witness noted that he was really just mimicking phrases the priest had said. Also, those mysterious scratch marks, some skeptics believe that Roland could have easily made them himself when no one was looking, which, I mean, come on, that's pretty easy to do. Additionally, psychologists who have looked into the case often wonder if, from the beginning, even the Lutheran priest, Schultz, that diagnosed the exorcism when he watched the stuff moving around the boy's home, may have been exaggerating the facts when he claimed there be demons here. Regardless of what truly happened, Roland Doe's case became legendary, inspiring William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel The Exorcist, which was later adapted into the terrifying and now classic 1973 horror film. The case has since been featured in books, documentaries, and even a 2000 movie titled Possessed, which aimed to stay closer to the real story. Whether you believe Roland was genuinely possessed or just a really dedicated trickster, his story left an undeniable impact on pop culture and made a whole generation terrified of Ouija boards, dark basements, and priests holding crucifixes. So was this really a case of demonic possession, or just an extreme example of teenage rebellion gone wild? The jury's still out, but if your bed ever starts shaking on its own, by golly, please just remember it's only Nosferatu playing a prank on you. It's likely not a demon. Have y'all ever watched Stranger Things, in particular Season 1? Yeah? Well, you sort of already know this part of the story then. Just like Eleven's mother in the show, real-life civilians were taken by government agents and had substances administered to them, often without their knowledge or consent, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, these substances might give them special abilities. This story I'm telling isn't just science fiction. It was a real CIA project known as MK-Ultra, launched in the early 1950s during the height of the Cold War with the goal of developing methods of mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation, using everything from LSD to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even electroshock therapy. Thousands of people, prisoners, mental patients, military personnel, and ordinary citizens became test subjects in secret experiments. Later projects even stemmed from these efforts, such as the oh-so-famous Project Stargate, which in the 70s aimed to investigate psychic phenomena like remote viewing, or the ability to perceive distant locations, objects, or events with your mind without the aid of any technology, aka the CIA wanted to develop psychic spies. Now, I'm sure in a later video I'm going to thoroughly discuss this wild lore, but before I get ahead of myself, let's make one thing clear. One of the most infamous cases tied to MK-Ultra, and among the first experiments as part of this strange and cruel program, took place during a retreat in Maryland at Deep Creek Lake, and this saga is best known as the story of Frank Olson. Frank Rudolph Emanuel Olson himself was a U.S. Army veteran and scientist who studied at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his advisor, aka PhD boss during this time at Wisconsin, was one Ira Baldwin, a character that's infamous in this saga as the director of MK Ultra. In the Stranger Things world, he would have been Dr. Martin Brenner, for instance. Anyways, Ira would summon Frank Olson to join him when he went to direct this secretive program where he was essentially, early on, trying to develop biological weapons. And this work would commence at what would go on to become Camp Detrick. Here, beginning in 1943, the U.S. bioweapons program would begin, and many things that I'm sure are still frequently researched but would be considered unethical in modern day would be performed. And as part of this saga, at one point, Frank Olson, who on November 19th of 1953 was a civilian scientist and the chief of the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, and 9 members of the CIA, would visit a cottage in Deep Creek Lake, which for some reason, despite being a vacation destination in the area, would play host to this secretive meeting whose goals might feel better a part of an X-Files episode than a real-world event. Anyways, what happened here was initially a mystery to all but those involved. All that's known is when Olson returned home, he would be different. He was withdrawn, and soon after told his wife that he had made a terrible mistake, and that he was going to resign from Fort Detrick. After this, though, on November 24th, he would leave for New York City with another CIA affiliate, telling his family that he needed to get help. He would, of course, never return from this trip, and the next thing his wife knew, he had fallen, I say in quotes, from his hotel room window. Of course, officials would simply determine that Frank fell or jumped from this window, and for a while, like 2 decades a while, that would be that. That is until a 1975 Rockefeller Commission report would reveal a lot more about this incident, essentially showing that in November of 1953, when Frank and those CIA individuals had visited the cabin or cottage at Deep Creek Lake, the CIA representatives administered mind-altering substances to Frank and other civilian scientists prior to his passing. These substances were given to the scientists unknowingly, and 20 minutes after ingesting it, I suppose so they didn't try to get rid of it, I say in quotes themselves, they'd be told what they took. After this report, President Ford would invite the family to the White House, where he would formally acknowledge what happened, apologize, and turn over pertinent documents, and settle with the family for $750,000. After these admissions, in June of 1994, more information, or clues I guess, would come to light, when Frank's well-preserved body was exhumed and found to be quite battered and bruised all over, to the extent that when he jumped from the window, he likely would have been unconscious due to the head injuries before his fateful leap. So, not necessarily injuries completely consistent with a fall from a 13th-story hotel window, more so injuries consistent with a member of the CIA helping him take that leap. To this day, regardless, the extent to which that infamous cottage at Deep Creek Lake was used is unknown, though this story certainly suggests that there is more to this tale than we will ever be told by the powers that be. Perhaps the best-known encounter with something unusual in the sky in Maryland is the Loch Reservoir UFO incident. This incident finds its origin in October of 1958, when late that month an individual named Philip Small, a 27-year-old man who worked in finance, and his friend, Alvin Cohen, a 24-year-old worker at Search Roebuck and Company, found themselves driving by the Loch Reservoir over a bridge that no longer exists, passing over it. Here, as they approached, they saw something unusual, a light in the sky floating above this bridge that, according to them, was shaped like an egg. Suddenly, their car would stop functioning, according to them, and they'd make the dubious decision of exiting their vehicle and hiding behind their car rather than inside of it. From here, they would observe this short-lived encounter with the flying object for just a moment, before suddenly they would see a flash of light, feel a sudden burst of heat, and hear a loud booming sound, which they would describe as being akin to thunder that followed a lightning strike. And with this strange series of events, the egg-like craft would quickly jet off into the sky. After this event, their car would miraculously start back up, and they'd quickly make their way to a nearby phone booth at the corner of Lochraven Boulevard and Joppa Road, where they'd call the Ground Observer Corps, or at least the individuals they called would put them in contact with this group. Apparently, the man who answered the phone actually thought they were bluffing at first and hung up on them. Without being dissuaded, though, the men would next simply call the Towson Police Department, who would send patrolmen to take a police report. And the two men would go to a nearby hospital, fearing they'd been exposed to radiation. It seems like they were fine, though, as they were quickly discharged without any treatment. Eventually, it seems the Air Force took an interest in the case as the two men were interviewed by a U.S. Air Force second lieutenant, and other witnesses to strange lights in the sky this night were also interviewed, and this case was even cataloged as part of Project Blue Book, an Air Force project that essentially cataloged and investigated unexplained aerial phenomena from the 1940s to the 1960s, and like most cases in this pamphlet, this one would fall into the bucket of unexplained. Anyways, this UFO incident is fairly unremarkable, but remains one of the better-known pieces of UFO lore in the state these days. Heck, from what I can tell, I may even be the only dude on YouTube to cover it. Regardless, let me know, have you been to this reservoir, and while you were there, did you see any unexplainable lights in the sky? I would love to hear your stories. Maryland, as I'm sure you're well aware, has multiple nicknames, with perhaps the most notable entry among them being the Free State, a name that many sources might say is a nod towards its long-standing history of political freedom and religious tolerance, or maybe even the fact that it was recognized as a free state in regards to slavery on November 1st of 1864 when it abolished the practice. But if you do a bit of digging, you'll find that this nickname, the Free State, is actually rooted in something a bit more humorous, and surprisingly familiar to me as someone who likes to throw wild colonies of yeast into some wort from time to time. This nickname, in actuality, dates back to a political quibble during Prohibition, a period from 1920 to 1933, when the production, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages were banned by the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. During this period, one particularly adamant supporter of the ban of alcohol was Georgia Congressman William D. Upshaw, who would ridicule Maryland as, I quote, a traitor to the Union for refusing to pass a state enforcement act in relation to the production, distribution, and consumption of alcohol. I should note, it's not like Georgia was particularly dry during this period, as there's well-known examples of active speakeasies across Georgia, ranging from Atlanta's Cotton Club and the Drake Hotel to Savannah's Green Lantern, places that politicians themselves were very known to frequent. Regardless, because of this interstate squabble, Mr. Owens, while not immediately publishing it, would write a mock-serious editorial entitled The Maryland Free State, which satirically proposed that Maryland would rather secede from the United States than prohibit the sale of alcohol. Over time, this nickname would gain traction in some of his later writings, and y'all would end up with your oh-so-famous nickname today that, frankly, not enough people know the origin of. Anyways, while we're out here talking about Maryland's excellent brews, I've got to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to Elder Pine in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and Black Flag in Columbia. Thanks for making great brews and making the Free State blood flow smooth. The Rat Utopia experiment is a story of scientific research that starts slow but has a wild implication for what happens when a population continues to grow and becomes more dense. Some, of course, take it to be solely reflective of rat population dynamics, but others consider that maybe, just maybe, it might also hold true for humans. If you were only going to listen to one story on this list, I highly recommend sticking it out to the end of this one. This story begins after World War II, a time when environmentalists were pushing to avoid overusing resources. One particular faction of these environmentalists was a group known as the Malthusians, named after Thomas Robert Malthus, an individual who, in a 1798 essay, argued that while human populations increase exponentially, food production can only increase linearly. That result, something you can probably predict, a lack of food, or in his words, a Malthusian catastrophe. Of course, while we know that this so-called catastrophe didn't actually occur in the 18th or 19th centuries as he predicted, the Malthusians used his philosophy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overpopulation. These Malthusians weren't exactly fringe thinkers either. Their fears that overpopulation would lead to widespread social and environmental issues were common in contemporary media, and even today, concerns about overpopulation persist. With these concerns in mind, researchers sought to understand the symptoms of overpopulation, and perhaps the best, certainly the most controversial, example of this research is a set of experiments now known colloquially as the Mouse Utopia experiments or the behavioral sink experiments, as labeled by John B. Calhoun. Calhoun, born in 1917, developed an early interest in science, attending meetings of the Tennessee Ornithological Society and even publishing work on bird populations when he was just 15. He went on to study at the University of Virginia before earning his PhD in animal behavior from Northwestern University in 1942. Afterwards, he conducted early studies on animal behavior using rats while teaching at Emory University and Ohio State University. Then, in 1946, he moved to Towson, Maryland, outside of Baltimore, where he worked on the Rodent Ecology Project at Johns Hopkins University, the project that would ultimately give rise to the bizarre experiments we're discussing today. In 1947, Calhoun's series of, let's say, unorthodox experiments began. He approached his neighbor about using his land to build something he called the Rat City. And no, Boston folks, I'm not saying he built the precursor to Allston. His neighbor agreed, likely not anticipating what Calhoun had in mind. With this blessing, Calhoun used a quarter of an acre of land to create a rat habitat that was essentially ideal, protecting the rats from predators and providing ample food, water, and shelter. Based on his prior work with rats, Calhoun estimated that this so-called Rat City could sustain 5,000 rats, acknowledging that at this level, the population density would be extremely high. To start, he placed 5 pregnant female rats into the enclosure. As expected, the population initially grew exponentially, but rather than continuing to increase until it reached the estimated critical point of 5,000 rats, the population inexplicably stopped growing at just 150 rats. Even stranger, instead of spreading out uniformly, the rats formed small social groups and concentrated in specific areas, limiting themselves to particular feeding locations. After 2 years, Calhoun ended the experiment and the population never, ever exceeded 200 rats. Now, the major reason why this didn't happen is because of infant mortality, which was extraordinarily high. As the population reached around 200, mother rats began neglecting their young, leading to an extreme decline in survival rates. Being a scientist, though, Calhoun was undeterred. If anything, this experiment gave him new questions to investigate. About 5 years after Rat City, he joined the National Institute of Mental Health, where he continued his work by designing new habitats, sometimes called universes, to conduct further experiments. These experiments replicated the conditions of Rat City, an environment where every rat's basic needs, food, water, companionship, nests, and even optimal temperature control, were fully met. Ultimately, in 1962, Calhoun published his most famous work, Population Density and Social Pathology. In the introduction of this work, he chillingly referenced our earlier discussion, stating, and I quote, "In the celebrated thesis of Thomas Malthus, vice and misery impose the ultimate natural limits on the growth of populations. Students of the subject have given most of their attention to misery, that is, to predation, disease, and food supply as forces that operate to adjust the size of a population to its environment. But what of vice? Setting aside the moral burden of this word, what are the effects of the social behavior of a species on population growth, and of population density on social behavior?" He then described his experiments. He divided a 10 by 14 foot enclosure into 4 equal-sized sections with electric fences between them. 3 bridges connected these quadrants, allowing the rats to move freely. Each section had food, water, and nesting areas. However, Calhoun made specific modifications to certain sections. Some staircases were shorter, some food was harder to access, and different experiments started with varying numbers of rats, split evenly between males and females. As before, Calhoun estimated that the enclosure could sustain about 40 rats. So how did things play out? At first, females distributed themselves evenly, while males fought for dominance. But once the hierarchy was established, things got weird. Less dominant males were pushed into the center of the living quarters, while dominant males guarded their territories, which included groups of females. Strangely, some submissive males were allowed into the dominant rat's territory, but these males never attempted to mate. Instead, they tried to mate with the dominant male, who didn't protest. Meanwhile, the social structure of feeding also took a turn. Some feeding stations were harder to access, requiring rats to eat side by side. Over time, they became so conditioned to eating with companionship that some refused to eat unless another rat was present. This behavior, combined with the population density, led more rats to congregate in the already crowded center pens, exacerbating the problem. Notably, this effect was less pronounced when food was easier to consume. This led to what Calhoun called the behavioral sink, an increase in pathological behaviors due to population density. These behaviors manifested differently in males and females. Females built fewer nests and neglected their young, resulting in infant mortality rates exceeding 90% in some cases. Meanwhile, the males who could sense when the females were in heat relentlessly pursued them. According to Calhoun, the male rats fell into a few distinct categories. I should note these were categories he defined. I do not believe these previously existed in any literature. These categories were pansexuals, rats that would mate with any rat of any age or gender, somnambulists, or rats that were completely disengaged from social interactions, and finally, probers, hyperactive, hypersexual, and pansexual rats that even attempted to mate despite aggression from dominant males. Some also engaged in cannibalism, particularly targeting the young rats. By the experiment's end, Calhoun predicted that if left to continue, the entire rat colony would have eventually collapsed. Now, because humans love drawing parallels, many quickly applied these findings to human societies, especially densely populated cities. And to be fair, Calhoun himself invited this comparison in the way he designed the experiments and described the rats' social hierarchy in the literature. However, many scientists reacted to the study in ways that, as a scientist myself, I'm not exaggerating, this is literally my day job, I would consider unscientific. For example, psychologist Carl Rogers claimed the resemblance to human behavior is frightening, citing family dysfunction, hyper-attraction due to overcrowding, alienation of children, and urban complacency in the face of crime. Of course, actual research followed, and results were mixed. Some cities exhibited behaviors resembling Calhoun's experiments, while others did not. In short, there was no conclusive evidence showing that Calhoun's experiments reflected human behavior. As for Calhoun, though, he wasn't done yet. 11 years later, he would publish another ominously titled study, Death Squared: The Explosive Growth and Demise of a Mouse Population. In the very first paragraph of this paper, Calhoun made it clear that he believed his findings reflected the state of mankind, even referencing the apocalypse from the Book of Revelations. Alright dude, dramatic much? Anyways, he described his new experiment, which was largely the same as his previous studies, but with a few notable changes. First, he used a different breed of mouse, house mice. Second, he designed a new enclosure with wall-mounted housing areas inside metal tubes, which he called walk-up apartments. This enclosure, which he believed could support up to 3,840 mice, was ultimately named Universe 25. This time, his methods also changed. He didn't intervene or control the population. Instead, he introduced 8 mice, 4 males and 4 females, into Universe 25 and simply let them do their thing uninterrupted. For the first 104 days, the mice went through what he called the adjustment phase. Basically, they spent a lot of time getting used to each other, which mostly meant fighting. Then came the exploitation phase, spanning days 104 to 315. During this time, the population doubled every 55 days until day 315. At that point, the doubling rate slowed to every 145 days, and groups of mice began forming in different parts of the enclosure, just like in previous experiments. Now here's where things get interesting. In his earlier studies, Calhoun had designed the enclosures specifically to encourage this kind of gathering behavior, but this time, the mice still grouped together, even though nothing in the enclosure was designed to force it. In other words, mice were doing this naturally. This marked the beginning of Phase C, stagnation, lasting from day 315 to 560, and this is where things got creepy. See, in the wild, mice that don't fit into a social structure will leave and find a new group, but in this experiment, they couldn't leave, so instead they withdrew. Many of these mice, mostly males, formed a passive pool in the center of the enclosure, where they were eerily inactive, covered in scars from fights with dominant males, and when attacked, they didn't even try to defend themselves, they just kinda took it. Meanwhile, the females, who didn't fit into the social structure, behaved differently. Instead of gathering in the center, they isolated themselves inside of the walk-up apartments at the enclosure's edge. At this point, the dominant males became too exhausted to defend their territories, and that meant the females had to start defending their own spaces. But there were so many mice that aggression became constant. Mice even began turning against their own young. The stress became overwhelming. Many mother mice abandoned their litters entirely, or in some cases they were even absorbing their unborn offspring in the womb. Then came the death phase, which started after day 560. At this stage, most of the mice were young, rejected by their mothers, and forced out of their nests early. Since they weren't raised properly, they couldn't develop normal social behaviors. And the result of this? Females would have fewer and fewer children, and even when they did, they lacked the instincts to care for them properly. Males would stop fighting, stop mating, and basically stopped doing anything. They ate, drank, slept, groomed themselves, and that was that. In short, social behaviors completely collapsed, and the population stopped reproducing. Eventually, all of the mice with reproductive instincts aged beyond fertility, sealing their fate. Once again, Calhoun interpreted his results as a dire warning for humanity, suggesting that if we continued on our current path, we'd meet the same fate. He urged society to correct its course. So, after probably 15 minutes of discussing this, what's the takeaway? Well, Calhoun's experiments suggest that when all physical space is occupied and every social role is filled, the stress on individuals leads to a total breakdown of complex social behaviors, eventually causing the population to collapse. Calhoun saw this as a dark omen for humanity's future, warning that if we don't manage urbanization and population growth carefully, we could face similar consequences. But should we really take this study that literally? Sure, Calhoun's mouse apocalypse sounds terrifying, but humans aren't mice. We have culture, institutions, and technology that allow us to adapt in ways that rodents simply can't. Some researchers even argue that this behavioral sink isn't a perfect metaphor for human society, pointing out that Calhoun's mice had no way to adjust or innovate, something humans do all the time. A famous follow-up study looked at human prisoners under conditions of extreme overcrowding, trying to see if similar patterns emerged, but that study only raised more questions than answers, especially since it had its own set of ethical issues and artificial constraints that made it hard to draw clear conclusions. So while these studies are fascinating, we should be careful about assuming they predict exactly what will happen to human civilization. That said, Calhoun's ideas still echo in today's world. Cities are getting more crowded, mental health issues are on the rise, and people are feeling more disconnected than ever. But is this a true behavioral sink in the making, or are we, as humans, simply facing a new challenge that we'll find a way to overcome? Calhoun's results are certainly unsettling, but maybe, just maybe, his predictions aren't as inevitable as they once seemed. Whoa, alright, this has been a bit of an intense video. Exorcisms, government-led mind control experiments, and perhaps mistakenly translating findings about rats to humans. Let's take a quick detour and instead look at an interesting place for a few seconds. So if you are a citizen of the United States, I assume you've probably heard of the Washington Monument. If not, it's succinctly a towering obelisk located on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., dedicated to George Washington, the first president of the United States. It was designed by Robert Mills and construction on it completed in 1884 due to delays caused by funding issues and the Civil War. The structure is large, standing at 555 feet, and it is the tallest stone structure in the U.S. Today, it is a symbol of national pride, representing the country's foundational values that honors Washington's leadership. The monument remains a major historical and tourist landmark. But the thing is, this monument wasn't the first dedicated to George Washington, and as you stand there envisioning bald eagles and Huey helicopters flying overhead, there might be an even more patriotic spot just a meager 52 miles to the northwest in Boonsboro, Maryland. In Boonsboro, you see, there's another, earlier constructed Washington monument, that was built in 1827, over 50 years earlier, and as the legend goes, if you're to believe it, it only took Boonsboro residents a single day of hard work to construct it. It's said that on July 4th of 1927, 500 locals gathered to this hilltop and collected stones alongside the hill, dry setting them into place with no mortar at all. Now, at some point, I'm fairly certain this all becomes more legend than fact, but accounts of this day state that at about 4 p.m., this tower stood at 15 feet in height, and the Declaration of Independence was read from the steps of the monument, followed by some salutes of infantry being fired into the air. Of course, these days, this original Washington monument is bigger than it was that day. Over time, it was reconstructed in various ways and was raised 30 feet, and also it was restored a couple of times, most recently in 1936. Also, inside, similar to the more well-known Washington Monument, you can make your way up to the top. In this one with a set of spiral stairs rather than the elevator in the one in DC. And from the top of this now 30-foot tower, you can patriotically view the surrounding landscape, and perhaps even see the more recently constructed Washington Monument in the distance if it's a clear sunny day. Anyways, let me know if you've been to this older Washington Monument. I'd love to hear about it. In the quiet woods of Sykesville, Maryland, where the Patapsco River winds through dense forests, lurks a legend as eerie as it is elusive, the legend of the Sykesville Monster. This monster was described to be a towering ape-like creature with dark fur over it that sort of looked akin to our ancestors, like human ancestors, and it was spotted beginning in the 1970s with tales as amazing as they are mind-boggling that suggest that, possibly, these encounters were of something that the feds and local law enforcement were all too aware of, and that they didn't want locals privy to what was truly going on in the area. This is the tale of the Sykesville Monster. The first reported sightings of this creature date back to the early 1970s, when a truck driver who apparently preferred to remain anonymous had a bizarre encounter one Friday evening. He claimed to have seen a figure of at least 7 feet tall covered in dark brown fur. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. In fact, his initial theory, it was a man on stilts. A really muddy man on stilts, to be exact, because as he put it, the figure was caked in mud from the waist down. When he spotted the creature, it was just sitting there, minding its own business, but as soon as it noticed him, it bolted into the woods, leaving behind a few more questions than answers. This sighting stirred up quite a bit of commotion in the small community just a few dozen miles from Baltimore, and to be honest, the reactions were all over the place. Some were convinced it was just a guy on stilts pulling a prank. Others speculated that it was an escaped patient from the nearby Springfield State Hospital. And then there were those who labeled it a prowler, which, as far as I can tell, just means a guy wandering around at night. Hardly a crime, though the locals seemed oddly offended by the idea of someone taking a nighttime stroll. Regardless, this first sighting appeared to have been an isolated incident, ending as soon as the truck driver laid eyes on the creature. The most well-known and far more dramatic encounter with the creature was still to come, though, and this one would involve a man named Lon Strickler. In 1981, Lon, a fisherman, made a discovery along the Patapsco River that would change everything. This was the sighting that solidified the Sykesville Monster's place in local legend, ensuring its eerie legacy would live on to this day. According to Lon Strickler, on the morning of May 9, 1981, he was fly fishing on the Patapsco River about a mile from Route 32. It was 10 a.m. on a cool, breezy 60-degree day, the kind of weather that's perfect for wading in a stream, if you don't mind a bit of a chill, that is. Worth mentioning, this wasn't new territory for Lon. He'd fished this spot plenty of times before, but on this particular day, he was about to catch something far stranger than a fish. It was at this point that something caught his attention. About 50 yards away from him, a stray dog was nosing around near the riverbank. Nothing unusual, just a dog doing dog things. But after a few minutes, the dog started to bark and growl, clearly agitated by something. Again, not exactly cause for alarm. My own dog will lose her mind over a deer in the woods, so Lon probably wasn't too concerned at first. But when he glanced back at the dog, he saw something else, a large, hairy figure moving through the trees. Whatever it was, the dog immediately stopped barking. Then came a loud yelp, followed by silence. Now, if you're like me and already worried about the dog, don't panic. Sorry for the spoiler, but the dog is fine. He shows up later. In this moment, though, Lon had bigger concerns than the dog. The massive, fur-covered figure stood up, and for the first time, he got a sense of its height. It wasn't just big, it was huge. Intrigued, or maybe just caught up in the moment, Lon decided to follow it. He did his best to keep up, but his heavy waders weren't exactly built for pursuit, and the creature eventually outpaced him. That being said, as he trailed behind it, he noticed something else, a strange, musky odor in the air. Lon later described this as similar to fox urine, which, thankfully, I can't personally confirm. But strong, foul smells are a recurring theme in Sasquatch lore, whether it's the massive, forest-dwelling Bigfoot of the Pacific Northwest or Florida's swamp ape. These creatures all seem to come with their own built-in stench. After losing sight of the creature, Lon headed back to his car, intending to drive into town and call the police. On the way, he spotted the dog again, now with a bit of blood on it, but still moving fine, so he figured it was alright. That crisis was at least mostly averted. As long as the dog's okay, I'm cool with the story. He drove to a local bar to use the payphone there, where he briefly considered grabbing a beer, because honestly, who wouldn't grab a beer after seeing a 7-foot-tall, hairy forest monster? But duty called, so he made his report instead. The police told him to return to the area to meet them, so he did. But when he got back to the river, things took a weird turn. The state police were already there, and they immediately ordered Lon to leave. They insisted that whatever he saw might be dangerous, completely ignoring the fact that he was the one who called them in the first place. Despite his protests, they weren't interested in hearing his side of the story. So Lon left, sort of. An hour later, curiosity got the better of him, and he returned to the scene. This time, the place was swimming with state police and some other vehicles, whatever that means. When he tried asking questions, nobody would give him an answer. The only thing he managed to pry out of anyone was that hair samples had been found in the forest, which, raises a whole lot more questions than answers, like everything else in this video. Even in the years following the incident, Lon tried to keep following up, but all he got was radio silence. Every time he asked, he was either told that no further information was available, or even more suspiciously, that no record of the incident existed at all. Frustrated, and apparently unwilling to let a good mystery go unsolved, Lon decided to take matters into his own hands. If no one else was going to investigate the Sykesville monster, then he would. During his investigation, Lon uncovered some pretty intriguing details. First and foremost, he received a message from someone who claimed to have been on the response team that shut down the road after his call. According to this individual, not only were hair samples collected, but the feds also showed up, with helicopters no less, to search for what was apparently being referred to as Bigfoot. Unfortunately, this same source also claimed, and I quote, "None of our guys would see it, and by our guys I assume he meant state troopers. And by it sounds like they were hunting for something big, hairy, and very much not a bear. Beyond this, Lon managed to track down the truck driver from the 1972 sighting and began compiling reports of other strange encounters with this mysterious large hairy figure. These included an alleged home invasion, which frankly raises a lot of follow-up questions too, and an incident where the creature was supposedly caught raiding a chicken coop, because even cryptids apparently love a good snack. Interestingly, most of these events took place near the Patapsco State Park. Determined to bring this creature to life, metaphorically, not literally, let's hope, Lon decided to have a composite sketch made too. He reached out to a retired police sketch artist, providing multiple witness descriptions, including his own, and when the artist finished the sketch, he reportedly asked Lon, "Are you sure this is what you saw?" and added, "This looks like a rendering of early man." According to Lon, that's exactly what he saw in the woods that day. The story doesn't end here, though. A few years later, while Lon was out fishing again, because someone's got to catch the fish, right? He met a man named Phil, who shared an unsettling discovery. According to Phil, large skeletal remains had been found along the south bank of the Piney Run. These bones were discovered by another fisherman off of a nearby trail, and when Phil and his friend went to check it out, they quickly realized these remains weren't your average human skeleton. The bones were far too large, and there were no clothing or any other identifying marks. Naturally, they would call the police, and when authorities arrived, they quickly roped off the area with crime scene tape, and it wasn't long before helicopters and unmarked vehicles showed up, much like the ones Lon had witnessed all those years ago. Shortly afterwards, the remains were of course taken away, leaving behind many, many questions. To make things even stranger, just a few miles downriver at the Liberty Reservoir in 2001, a handful of people claimed to have seen a large hairy figure roaming in the woods. And that, folks, is the gist of the story. Do I know what to make of all of this? Honestly, I'm not sure, but according to several witnesses, there seems to be a large, hairy figure wandering the forests of Maryland near Sykesville, and possibly even a breeding population. Who knows? Maybe it's just a legend, or maybe there's something more to it. What do you think? Have you seen this critter? Have you heard a story about it? Maybe even had a relative encounter one? Let me know in the comments below, or even better, shoot me an email with your story. Who knows, maybe I'll feature it in a future video. In Baltimore, Maryland, between 1949 and 2009, something curious would happen every year on January 19th. As the story goes, a man, his identity cloaked by a mask, would attend to Edgar Allan Poe's grave bearing 3 red roses and a bottle of cognac, leaving behind a letter many of the times. This day, too, was of significance, as it was the birthday of Poe. That being said, despite this event occurring for the better part of a century, the identity of this man or men would never be revealed. This is the story of the so-called Poe Toaster. Now, if you don't know, we should start by describing Poe briefly. Edgar Allan Poe was a 19th century American writer, poet, and literary critic, best known for his macabre and gothic tales, such as The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Raven. His works often explored themes of madness, death, and the supernatural, influencing the horror and mystery genres profoundly. Despite his literary brilliance, Poe led a troubled life marked by personal loss, financial hardship, and struggles with alcoholism. He was a deeply melancholic figure, haunted by the early death of his mother, his wife Virginia, and many others close to him, which likely influenced the dark themes in his writing. Poe's death, too, remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American literary history, and of his life. On October 3rd of 1849, he was essentially found in a delirious state on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that didn't belong to him and unable to explain what had happened. He was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he drifted in and out of consciousness, reportedly calling out the name Reynolds in his final moments. He died on October 7th at the age of 40, and the official cause of death was simply listed as congestion of the brain, a vague and common term at the time. No medical records or autopsy report exist, leaving his cause of death open to speculation. Theories about Poe's demise range from alcohol poisoning, rabies, and carbon monoxide poisoning to foul play. One popular and perhaps the most reasonable theory is that he was a victim of cooping, a form of election fraud where individuals were kidnapped, force-fed alcohol or drugs, and forced to vote multiple times under different identities. Given that Poe was found on election day near a polling place, this theory has gained traction among historians. Others suggest he succumbed to withdrawal, a medical condition, or even murder. His mysterious final days, much like his stories, have fueled fascination for generations, adding an eerie layer to his already haunted legacy. Now, regardless of how he passed, Poe remains a well-known American literary figure to this day, and perhaps it is this notoriety that gained him the respect of the so-called Poe Toaster. As I said, this began in 1949, or at least this action was first observed then. On the centennial of Poe's death on his birthday, this masked man would attend Poe's grave, leaving him cognac and 3 roses, which are speculated to be a nod to the 2 other individuals buried alongside Poe, his wife and mother-in-law. This toaster would arrive wearing an all-black outfit, a large hat, and a scarf, wearing this and the mask every single year they attended his grave, and they would usually arrive between midnight and 6 a.m. Eventually, onlookers on these days would observe this tradition first once, then twice, and then it became apparent that this was no infrequently occurring event. Throughout the years, my impression is that observing this Poe Toaster became a sort of local sport. For instance, in an article I'm referencing, a dozen folks waited watching Poe's grave from inside of an unlit Presbyterian church, only to finally see him at 3 a.m., when he would climb a fence and peruse the cemetery grounds from an off angle to avoid possible individuals waiting for him to enter on the street. He would then place the roses and cognac and slip into the shadows. Additionally, over time, some of the notes left behind were made public, often being picked up by various members of the community before being turned over, and they said interesting things, not necessarily relevant to Poe. For instance, one I found said, "The sacred memory of Poe and his final resting place is no place for French cognac. With great reluctance, but for respect for family tradition, the cognac is place. The memory of Poe shall live evermore. This note was perhaps a reference to the ongoing French opposition to the war in Iraq that was occurring at the time. Other notes captured something we'll cover in a second, such as the 1993 note that said, "The torch will be passed," and in 2001 when a note was left that said, "The New York Giants, darkness and decay, and the big blue hold dominion over all." This one I find funny because it sort of borrows from Poe's own The Mask of Red Death, while simultaneously tossing shade at the local Baltimore Ravens fans. For context, in 2001, the Giants were playing the Super Bowl just 9 years later on January 28, 2001, and the toaster was essentially indicating he'd be rooting for the Giants despite living in Baltimore. In 1999, however, there was a break in the tradition. A note was left behind that would basically state that the original toaster had passed away, and his sons were to carry the proverbial torch henceforth. These sons, however, were clearly not as committed to the proverbial bit as the OG toaster, and they were noted to occasionally show up in street clothes, lacking the mask, and they'd occasionally leave notes that didn't really make any sense, kind of like that 2001 note that I was talking about. Ultimately, in 2009, there would be no toaster after all, and some sources, such as the one I'm reading from the Smithsonian Magazine, suggested the growing awareness of the toaster eventually had scared them off. That being said, the toasts to Edgar Allan Poe have not been forgotten. As of 2016, the Maryland Historical Society held auditions for a formal Baltimore's next Poe Toaster, a man who would dress in the same clothing as the original toaster and perform this sacred and time-honored tradition of leaving roses and cognac for poor old Poe by his grave. In Bladensburg, Maryland, just 1,749 feet from the Washington, D.C. border, along Bladensburg Road, lies a spot that at first glance might seem entirely unremarkable, a field adjacent to a rather unattractive storm drain. To the casual observer, it's just a place where dogs might take a quick pit stop. But in my line of work, I've learned that the more mundane something appears to be today, the more intriguing its history might be. It's a bit of a joke, but there's some truth to it. This unassuming lot was once known as Blood Run. While today the drainage ditch carries water, in the past it was aptly named for the blood that flowed here. Why, you ask? Well, in the 1800s, as early as 1808, this area became a hot spot for duels. The reason? It was because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., which made it a convenient location just outside of the city's jurisdiction. In 1839, following the fatal duel between Congressman Jonathan Siley and William J. Graves, Congress passed a law banning dueling within the district. However, this only served to increase the popularity of Bladensburg as a dueling ground, with approximately 50 duels fought there between 1808 and 1850. Some of these duels that were the most notable include on March 22nd of 1820, a duel between naval heroes Commodore Stephen Decatur and Commodore James Barron, who faced off here, resulting in Decatur's mortal wounding. Wow, I covered poor Decatur in 2 videos in a row. Poor dude shoots at the Jersey Devil in the last one and dies in this one. The last known duel occurred here in 1868, and today, a historical marker commemorates this dark and bloody ground, reminding us of the area's tumultuous past. So the next time you pass by this seemingly ordinary spot, remember the rich and rather dramatic history that unfolded here. It's a testament to how even the most unremarkable places can hold stories worth telling. I'm genuinely excited, too, to cover the spot in our Haunted Places series now. Tons of historical people here. Marylanders, I had a blast with you in this Volume 1. It was so fun to start digging into the weird stuff that happened in a state that I've almost moved to like 4 times now. Now, if you want more stories for your state, or just more of this series in general, drop a comment below and let me know what you want to see next. Also, if you enjoyed the ride, hitting like and subscribing helps me get one step closer to my goal of 100,000 subs in 2025. Seriously, it's free and quick, and it lets YouTube know that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. As for what's next, I'm thinking I'm gonna try a Dark Places episode on Mount Hood, and then I'm sorta thinking we meander down south a bit and take a quick look at Texas. After that, who knows what state we'll visit or dark places we'll cover. But if you have strong opinions, you know I'm always open to those down below. And remember, most importantly, whether your neighbor just bought a bunch of rats and built a rather large enclosure in his backyard, or if you were fishing the Patapsco and saw something really tall watching you from the edge of the woods, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.